I want to talk more in a little bit about, some of the benefits for working people and some of the ways we would like to see this get ramped up. But I feel like you can't really have a general conversation about nuclear power without sort of speaking to some of the general concerns, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. Some of these systems can seem very complicated or foreign or quote unquote unnatural, despite the fact that these are, that this is something that does occur in nature. Um,
Mhm.
and just like speaking from, my personal experience, and I know a lot of people on the left, like the default position is to be anti-nuclear power. And I think there's probably history for that because of the association with nuclear weapons. We don't need to jump into that history. I want to focus more on the science here. But
Mhm.
I was somebody who was against nuclear power for a long time until I started talking to people who knew more than me. When I started talking to scientists, and I started understanding these systems. So I was wondering if we could maybe walk through some of these kind of common questions or concerns that people have. And, I think it's fair that we like answer these, but, I don't want to exhaust the entire conversation on these because sometimes it can be, I don't know, a bit of a distraction and we miss the positive case for nuclear if we're always on the defensive. But the first one I want to start with is the one that I've been getting the most of lately, which is this question of waste. And I think a lot of people misunderstand waste. I know you've said before on other programs like the Jackman Show. I mean, there's always this kind of understanding of this like green goo, like from The Simpsons, is what is produced in a nuclear plant. I mean, could you explain one, what nuclear waste is, and two, that like the kind of concerns and questions people have about storage and how to process and deal with this waste oftentimes aren't really reflective of like the reality of people who are actually in this industry.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I left college with an environmental science degree and focused on energy and had no idea what nuclear waste looked like. So I'm never surprised when people don't know. So I do carry around a picture of a big fuel assembly and dry cask storage with me because I think once you take it from the imaginary spot into the real world, it's so much less scary. So, nuclear fuel is just a bunch of little uranium pellets about the size of the tip of your pinky stacked up into a long rod. And then a bunch of those rods are bundled together to make a fuel assembly. And that's what gets put into the reactor, cooks for some time, and then after 3 to 5 years gets pulled out and allowed to cool. And so when we talk about nuclear waste, it's just that spent nuclear fuel. And so currently, what we do in the US is we let that cool in cooling ponds, so big pools of water. And then once that's done, we use cranes to put them into what are called dry casks, but basically just imagine big steel and concrete containers. And so the spent fuel goes in there, it sits on site about like a fraction of a parking lot. You can think of a basketball court.
Hmm.
And in the US, this style of waste management has a 100% perfect safety record. No one has ever been harmed by the waste. No one has, had any like it's a perfect system. From an environmentalist perspective, the only issue that I have is that when that fuel is done in the reactor, we've only used about 5% of the potential energy in that
Mm.
uranium. So, in other countries like Japan and France and Russia, they actually recycle their waste to create new fuel. And so that's the problem I have with proposals that are like, oh, the waste is so uniquely dangerous that we need to bury it underground. We would spend so much money to prevent zero cancers, save zero lives, prevent zero hassle. And in fact, we would make it harder to get our next generation nuclear fuel.
Mm.
So it's perfect right where it is. I've been to a bunch of dry cask storage sites. You can hug it. I mean, most of the utilities require some convincing to let you hug it, but it has happened. So that's how we manage waste. And the idea that it's uniquely dangerous just isn't true. In fact, in the Netherlands, they've turned their central waste facility into a museum that's open to the public. So that's kind of my dream where these communities that have nuclear plants that have waste are allowed to like have local artists paint beautiful murals on it, make it a public park, but
Mhm.
allow people to see it. And I think you'll find that very quickly people are okay with the waste being there.
No, there's a couple more that I wanted to jump into, but, like, again, to be really clear, I mean, do you think that sometimes the way that, like, the idea of, for example, like, we need to bury all of our nuclear waste, like, deep, deep, deep in the earth, only adds to the kind of general feeling that it's extremely dangerous, when from my understanding, my personal feelings on this, I mean, that seems like something that you could do to sort of like calm people down, like, don't be worried about this, when we should just be making the positive case that this is very, very safe and this is nothing to be worried about in your community. And I love the art museum idea of just sort of inviting the public to be around this and understand that this is a perfectly safe thing to have in your community.
Yeah, I mean, I think it totally reinforces the idea. If someone tells me, "Hey, it's totally fine. We just need to bury this thing super deeply underground so that no one can ever
Hmm.
get to it, and put a bunch of signs so that if an apocalypse happens, future generations never like, it's so crazy that it's like, well, God, we shouldn't even mess with that, when that's just so far removed from what's actually true about the waste. I really do think the only people say, "Oh, the nuclear waste problem." The only
Yeah.
problem it has is that people think it has a problem, and it just doesn't.
And, like, again, as you were saying, like, the potential of recycling is like an incredible one that it's a shame that we're not utilizing more. Another kind of common, general concern is like, well, I don't want to live next to a nuclear plant because that's going to mean that I'm going to become irradiated and get all these kind of diseases. I mean, what would you say to somebody who had that kind of level of fear about living next to or near a plant?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of I think a lot of the understanding of radiation is sort of paradoxical, where we see it as something that's an acute exposure that if you're not careful, you may come in contact with.
Hmm.
When we are awash in ionizing radiation every day from space, from the ground, from foods we eat. It's seen as unnatural, something that comes from a nuclear plant that is like doesn't occur in nature, which, like you said, does actually fission does occur in nature when most of the radiation that we are exposed to is natural. And then people think it's mysterious that because it's odorless and tasteless, we don't know what it could shrink you, it could make you huge, kind of that sci-fi, when
Hmm.
really we know more about the human health impacts of ionizing radiation than almost any other hazardous agent. So, with this gulf in public perception and what's true, are we just screwed? Like, are we just destined to not be able to manage radiation risk? Well, no, we do it every day in doctors' offices and hospitals around the
Hmm.
world. We understand that small doses that come from diagnostic tests, which are on the same order of magnitude, if not greater than the doses we're talking about with nuclear workers. I mean, way higher than living near a nuclear plant.
Hmm.
We know that that's the little bit of increase in risk of cancer far down the line is well worth the information that gives. And in the cases of treating tumors and cancers, even high doses of radiation is worth it. So it's really again this public perception issue that somehow radiation from nuclear is uniquely dangerous and we need to avoid it at all costs. I think sometimes in a very technical sector, we get bogged down on the details. Like pro nuclear activists love to argue about LNT and like what's the exact model for like describing health impacts of radiation because they think if we can debunk the model, we're just going to have a massive nuclear build out. Either way, it's so small, who cares? And that message just gets totally missed. Putting radiation into context is so critical, and the industry has been absolute dog shit. Sorry, can I say dog
No,
shit?
that's fine. That's
Has
fine.
been very bad at it. And it's something that communicators are kind of stepping up to the plate to do.
No, and I think it's really important. We have had Lee Phillips on the show a lot. Like, just talking about the regular experience that we all have with radiation.
Mhm,
If you're on a plane, you're going to be exposed to some levels of radiation. Hell, my good friend and co-host Matt Leck, who
mhm.
sometimes has a big glass of milk, like he gets exposed to radiation went through that. It's something that is naturally occurring. There are levels of radiation just naturally occurring in the world around you, and again, like, are there certain levels of radiation that are dangerous? Yes. But is it something that you're going to be experiencing living next to like a nuclear facility? No. And I will say that, like, I think that it's, as somebody who is an advocate for nuclear power now, it's like, I think that there needs to be a lot more work done to sort of debunk and dispel a lot of these, worries that people have. But I would also say, if you are somebody who's skeptical about this, um, just look at the nuclear industry itself. Like, it takes all of these concerns like almost too seriously to where it actually hurts our ability to build out nuclear power. Right? This is not something that, like, you from the outside are the first person to sort of think that, like, I'm worried about radiation. It's like the nuclear industry and even advocates are talking about this constantly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's another thing where a lot of advocates say, oh, we're like, if nuclear were held to the same standards of coal and natural gas, then we could build, like, they would be way
Hmm.
less regulated. And I understand where they're coming from. But at the same time, I went to Bruce Power, the plant in Ontario, and met a former coal worker who worked at North America's largest coal plant who became a nuclear operator. It's a amazing story
Hmm.
about of a fossil to fission transition, and he said, I knew when I went to work at the coal plant that I was killing myself, like, that there I was increasing my risk of disease, that I would die early if I stayed here forever, and I come home every day from the nuclear plant to my kids knowing that that's a guarantee, that when I go to work, I'm coming home, I mean, yes, it's annoying, all of the precautions, but I'm safe. And so
Hmm.
I think, yes, that's true. I mean, the hoops they jump through are insane, but I mean, that's a great outcome is no nuclear plant has ever gotten close to the line of regulation that the NRC and EPA said, and workers are much safer and can be confident going to work because of it.
Could you talk a little bit about the difference in terms of like human mortality in different forms of electricity production, like nuclear compared to coal or all these other systems? I mean, nuclear is like far and away one of the safest ways to produce electricity on the planet.
Absolutely. And I always feel a little weird. I know a lot of nuclear advocates cite, like, 7 million people die prematurely every year from from just
Hmm.
typical fossil fuel usage. And I understand where they're coming from because all else equal, yes, fossil fuels are far more dangerous because they emit harmful pollutants that we breathe in. But if the question is there energy or not? There's no question, oops, that fossil fuels, having that energy from fossil fuels has had far more health outcomes and positive societal outcomes than if we were to get rid of that. But if you're just talking about on an equal playing field, where is it coming from? Nuclear has an incredible safety record. In the US, it's perfect. Really, there's one well, actually, let's just walk through the accidents.
Hmm.
That's
Yes,
helpful. There
please.
are 3 accidents that we think of that always come up when it comes to
Hmm.
nuclear power. The first, 3 Mile Island in the US, a partial meltdown in Pennsylvania, 0 people died. If you didn't evacuate and you lived within the radius of that plant, you got less the exposure of about an X-ray, but over a much longer time than an X-ray. So very little would have negligent health impacts, no environmental impacts, no other. I mean, it was a non issue, except that the industry had such horrible communications that it freaked people out and made it seem like there was a really big issue. The next is Chernobyl, and this is what people tend to think about
Hmm.
when they think of worst case what a worst case scenario nuclear meltdown looks like. This was it. It was an exposed reactor, like core exposed to the environment on fire, spewing radioactive particles. I mean, my God, I cannot imagine living through it. But we have the benefit of looking at the accident in hindsight after it's been studied for decades. And the UN health report on Chernobyl says that three workers died as a result of the initial explosion. 28 firefighters died of acute radiation syndrome, and 15 people died prematurely of thyroid cancer in the first 25 years after the accident. So, with the helicopter crash, 50 deaths. It also says that there could be 145 additional deaths from thyroid cancer, but these aren't immediate. This is like someone who might die at 70 versus 80. And Dr. Jerry Thomas of the Chernobyl Tissue Bank just says, based on these case histories of the patients, that number's probably on the very high end. They're just not seeing these cancers. There were no increases in any other type of cancer, no effect on infant mortality or malformations or fertility, nothing. And so 50 deaths up to possible 200. Chernobyl doesn't even break into the top 5 energy accidents of the 1980s.
Hmm.
And then Fukushima, 2 workers died when they drowned in the basement because of the tsunami, but no one died from radiation from Fukushima. Um, so you're talking about an incredibly small 50 to 100 or 50 to 200-ish deaths over the commercial nuclear power industry, and an incredible amount of power because nuclear is so energy dense. So
Mhm.
when you get the deaths per terawatt hour, it's so tiny, that even, it's on par with solar and wind, which are kind of a lot harder to track, especially solar. Most of the deaths come from installation. Think
Mhm.
about like
It's really, yeah. Mhm.
rooftop falls or like electrocution, which don't really get counted in the same way. So it's hard to tell. But either way, these are all so small that, the question is which can reliably power society or not.
No, I mean, I really appreciate you going through that because, like, you know, one, it's like I think it's important to like take those events seriously and to talk about how to avoid them.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I do think that like sprinting too quickly there ignores the conversation that is really important to understand what is the risk that we're trying to avoid, right? Like Chernobyl and
Hmm.
Fukushima, let's say, being like the worst in history. What is
Hmm.
like the consequence here? It's bad. We don't want to see that happen. But again, like the imagining of like, a Fallout style like hellscape is not really accurate to like what the risks here. So like we want to avoid them. There's a lot tremendous amounts of work in the industry to avoid them. A lot, as you were saying, like this has been studied immensely. Protocols have been put in place to avoid the kind of things
Right.
that cause those events. But again, like understanding is like, yes, we take them seriously. Here are the things we're trying to do to avoid them, but also here is what happened in the worst case scenario. Because I think when you let people imagine, we're going to imagine the craziest sequence of events as possible.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, I don't wanna be flippant and just say like,
Hmm.
"Chernobyl, who cares?" Because like I said, I can't imagine having lived through those accidents when there was not a lot of information coming from the authorities in any of those cases. There was a panic. Nuclear is still a relatively new technology. So, I do think it's better to be cautious and take precautions, especially when you're not sure. But then once the accident is over, and again we have the benefit of hindsight, it's important to really put those into perspective. And so what you see from these accidents is that even in the worst case scenario, the human health impacts and environmental impacts of nuclear power are just so small. And
Hmm.
then when you compare that to the enormous benefits, I mean, it's a no brainer.
Hmm. Well, let's talk about some of the benefits. I think and actually, if we could talk about this later. You could send them to me if you don't have any that come to mind. If somebody was feels like they need to hear it from somebody else or look into these things, are there any resources that you might suggest people to learn a little bit more about like the safety of these processes?
I have a ton of information on my Twitter and my Substack, but there's also great information at the World Nuclear Association
Hmm.
website. Now, some people, feel like they can't trust that because it's an industry association, but it's, completely cited from the UN, World Health Organization. It's all right there. So I would start there as a resource. And
Hmm.
I'm hopefully working on something that is acts as a repository for all of this so people don't have to dig through technical reports or industry websites to get it for themselves.
Excellent. Well, we'll put those links in the show notes for folks who are listening live. But
Mhm.
let's talk about some of the exciting stuff, right? So we're at this moment right now where we are facing a climate crisis. There's a lot of conversation about what we need to do, and we know that we do need to mitigate the levels of fossil fuels that we're burning to produce electricity.